What's up, my friends? I'm here to talk about a comic instead of our normal book talks today. They're all stories, and this channel's about the craft of narrative, so I figure this fits right in. This week, I am here to talk about Die, an Image Comics published series written by Kieron Gillen with art by Stephanie Hans. Kieron Gillen has a pretty crazy bibliography. He wrote The Wicked and Divine. He's currently writing Once and Future, as well as the new Marvel Eternals run. So we know he's got some chops to feed us a good story here. Die follows a Jumanji style story where a bunch of kids around the age of 16 get together for a special D&D homebrew one-shot for one of their birthdays, and they get isekai'd into the world as their characters. They escape after 2 years stuck in this world, and then, in classic Stephen King fashion, flash forward 27 years, and they find themselves slurped back in. This is where our story begins. Now, this is not a regular isekai, no Kirito to save the day. This is a horror fantasy story through and through. And the first volume makes sure that you know that by having a character from their past excursions in this world showing up all zombified, eyes turned maggoty, and it's only gonna get worse from there. Off the bat, the art in this comic is phenomenal. Stephanie Hans is incredible, and it shows in every frame that we see. I loved the use of color that is slightly muted in palette, but still so powerful when you see it on the page, and the change up of style for particular important thematic moments, and the overall beauty of the design of the characters, of the world. It all just comes together to create this beautiful, horrific fantasy. One of the most interesting aspects of this story is this reimagining of your typical D&D party. The core archetypes are still there, but the way that Gillen changes them up and makes them his own really adds to the tools at his disposal to create depth in these characters, with mechanics of the classes mirroring emotions and elevating character moments while staying true to the class as well as the person under the armor. The classes are also each tied to your typical Euclidean die in a tabletop. You got your D4, D6, D8, D12, D20, and some of these ties, class to die, have a bit more of a cutting intentional meaning, while others feel like a bit of a stretch. All of it is a fun interpretation and an interesting insight into why he chose these die for these classes, but it's not super critical to the story as a whole. I just thought I'd bring it up as a glimpse into the writer's mind of what comes first. Do you grab the D6 and then decide what class that goes to, or do you build a class and determine what die it goes to? And to see the thought process behind that is really interesting to me. And all of the classes are so cool. You've got the Grief Knight, which is like your paladin fighter who gains strength as their sadness increases, as well as having this ability to vampire away other people's sadness to suck into himself and absorb. The knights as a class are split up into 8 different emotional types, stemming from Robert Plutchik's idea of there being 8 core emotions, and this also nicely fits into the class being assigned the D8. You've got the Fool, a bard remix whose luck increases the more foolhardy his decisions and actions are, and the less hard they think about something before going in and doing it. You want to say that witty one-liner at the most dangerous moment? Steal the gold from the god? I'm sure you'll come out on top if you're the Fool. Nice and easy, very straightforward, super low brain, bestowed the D6 as the most standard of dice. You've got the Godbinder, the Cleric Class, who treats gods less as beings that they pray to and beg for assistance from, and the class is more treated as a demonologist, forcing the gods to use their powers for a deal or a price, something owed back in return for them to unleash this ability at that moment. That deal normally always comes back to bite you, normally when it's the most inconvenient time for you. Give this class to the atheist at your table, and it truly becomes more of this wheel and deal business-like transaction that happens between the god and the player. It's given the D12 for super artsy geometric reasons. You know, all the vertices and faces of a D12 are exact opposites of the vertices and faces of a D20. If the D20 rules the natural and physical laws of the world, the D12 should therefore be the one that's ruling all of the supernatural. I did okay in geometry, shapes are my brain. It makes sense if you don't think about it. There's the Neo, the Rogue class, super cyberpunk, cybertronic augments, robot dog, but their downside is they require Fey Gold to power their abilities. The gold turns to dust at dawn, and their abilities only last until dawn. This creates an interesting, almost addict archetype to the way that you have to play this character. You can't hoard gold and use it on a rainy day. It's gone in 12 hours. They need it to function, and they can't get enough of it. This class is given the D10, where the one 1 and 0 are binary for, man, it must really suck to have all your abilities locked behind microtransactions. We've got the Dictator. It's another bard on the other side of the coin from the Fool. This is a class that can manipulate people and bind their wills with words, forcing them to obey or love or feel the depths of despair with just a few words. They're given the D4, the complete opposite in size from the D20. With the D20, you have rules and mechanics and crunch. So the opposite with the D4, where it's soft, where the roleplay controls the battlefield, just as the Dictator does with their voice. And finally, you have the Master, the Wizard stand-in class. Manipulator of reality, tweaker of rules is written, and probably not a nice guy. Naturally, they're given the D20. I think that's kind of a gimme at this point. Super cool class. We don't get to see a whole bunch of it in this game as it is played, but it's got a very interesting concept behind it of being the game master, but also being a player. We follow our main narrator, Ash, our Dictator, as they try to get back out of the world that they once thought they were free from. There's a lot to appreciate in this story. The dialogue, while at times a bit more expository than I would like, is at other times beautifully poetic, outrageously hilarious, and just real. The conversations that are had between the characters, for the most part, feel real. They feel natural and modern without trying to be modern or hip with the kids. The rest of the writing is so strong and feels so natural that even those more expository moments I was kind of able to get through without being pulled out of this story. There is a care and a respect put into these characters. Not mental care. They all need therapy, like really bad. But the way they interact with each other, with the world, with their powers, it all serves to flesh them out and really paint a picture of this party and create this dichotomy of when they were teenagers stuck in this world, acting on kind of a power fantasy trip, and now, so many years later, put in the same shoes that they once wore, forced to face the ghosts of their past. And the writing does not shy away from their weaknesses or moments being horrible or having the characters make vastly the wrong decision. It leans into that, just as you would do at the gaming table. Those moments are what make the best story when you're sitting at the table, and they certainly serve to create the most interesting aspects of this story here. The story structure itself has a bit of a hiccup in the middle with the pacing, and near the end as well, where it feels to pick up a bit too fast for what I can only assume is deadline issues, which is a bit of a shame. Neither of these issues really detracted from the story all too much, nor did it really massively impact the effect that it had on me as a reader. Do I wish I was able to live in this world for a bit longer than we did? Yeah, you bet I did. But I still feel that despite these few flaws with pacing, I still came out of this story feeling like it was a well-told story. It explored themes that I didn't think it would, but it explored them well. And it was something that I felt super affected by in a really good way that you want to do when you're reading something like this. The structure of the comic is another awesome aspect here. I think there is a lot to be said about the freedom of the format of a comic versus a book when you're thinking about it from a narrative craft perspective. When you write a book, you're a bit locked in on the way you want to tell that story. But because this is given to you in volumes and you're kind of reading them chunk at a time, and on top of that, there are these 4 distinct arcs, it allows for us to not only experience those arcs in their own right, from introduction to the world, to minor adventure, to repercussions, to final arc, but each volume can explore something different and try something different. And we really see Gillen push that here. In the introductory arc, we get volumes dedicated to giving us backstory and depth to each of the members of the party so that we can better solidify and flesh them out. And we also have these volumes where, similar to Araki in JoJo, it feels more like Gillen has clearly been hyper-focused on research for something and just needed to get that information out of his system in 20 pages or explore an idea in that way. And it all comes together. It all serves to tell the story just as well as a book did, just with a few more interesting mix-ups in approach and craft that we get to see that you probably wouldn't see too often in a book unless the book is specifically going to target weird ways of storytelling because of that normal, expected, strict structure that readers expect from a book. There's also something to be said about the actual world building that occurs in this story. The interweaving of this reconstruction and homebrew of character classes with clear and at times blatant reinterpretations of real world literary ideas. It all fits into what a homebrew tabletop RPG feels like when you're actually playing it. Did your DM just spend like a week binging all of Lord of the Rings? You bet you're gonna be seeing that in your campaign next week. Or maybe they dipped it a little bit into H.G. Wells. So all of a sudden you're seeing all these tripodic aliens walking around, or time travel just got thrown into the mix. We get to see those influences on a DM here, as well as those smaller touches where the beautiful Fae Queen looks like that girl a grade above him that he's been crushing on, or a bunch of the enemies look like school bullies that have been causing a lot of torment in your real life. Now, I want to be clear. Yes, this is a fantasy story about a D&D world, but it is most certainly not your typical adventure. It's a return to a world where adventures have already taken place, a world moved on to an extent. The gears are still turning here, but the players have already gone on their heroic quest and saved the day. Now they have to return. They have to see the aftermath of their actions, good and bad. They have to get through this world without the lens of fresh and new and more horror and fear of what they might see dredged up from their past. I love that kind of story. And of course, Die is at its core a love letter to the tabletop RPG genre. I mean, they even made their own TTRPG for this. The story explores themes of escapism and finding yourself through that escapism and freedom to explore possibilities that you might not be able to in the real world, exploring who you really are as a person. These things, on top of telling a wonderful, horrible, beautiful, ugly, happy, sad story, are what TTRPGs truly embody. Coming together with your friends, surrounding a table, letting the dice fall, and seeing where it takes you. Now, I have had the graces to be blessed with a consistent tabletop group for 10 years. People have come and gone, hiatuses have taken place, but we've been through it. We've done the impossible and taken characters from first level to beyond 20th level to epic levels and hitting level 30 in the 3.5 edition of D&D. We've explored our fanfiction worlds in GURPS, told epic tales stretching across hundreds of years across multiple DMs, all in the same world to see outcomes of what came after those great battles fought on greater battlefields. I've done my fair share of min-maxing and number crunching to ensure that my wizard could make time stop last forever and do 6-digit damage to the final boss of a campaign at the cost of the sacrifice of my own character. I have lived and breathed the emotions that Die intends to instill in a reader in the horrific way that it does. And it pulls it off, and it pulls me back to those memories of those campaigns that I got to play with all of my friends. Something I'm able to appreciate from my tenure of TTRPGs is just how well Gillen is able to convey consequences in this story. While the DM and the players should be working together to tell a good story, you can't just let your players walk to the finish line. That's not where emotions come from. That's not going to get your players crying at the table or shouting in exasperated victory after a very close, almost total party kill. The emotion comes from the hardship, the struggle, the give and take, the ramifications for that stupid decision to try and make fun of the god to his face. And this floods through the world of Die, from the ramifications of their past actions when they were here as teenagers, to the costs of their powers, to the impact and the waves they are creating anew in this return to the world and the actions they're currently taking. And it creates such a compelling story. We see it happen time and time again, where the thing that feels good to do often ends up creating the worst outcomes, just like it happens at the table when the dice come out. And that's so cool to be able to see this written example of a lot of the emotions and a lot of the actions that when I'm playing D&D or any other tabletop RPG. I'm gonna give Die like a D12. The most slept on of the Euclidean dice. I think only barbarians have a D12 hit die in D&D. At least they used to be the only ones. And don't even come talking to me about the D100 being more slept on. That's an abomination. I don't even want to hear about it. Just roll 2D10. It's way easier and it's way less weird and scary to look at. This comic is strong and emotional and really gets to the point of coming together at a gaming table to tell a story with friends, which is a rather wholesome theme for this extremely grim, dark, and horrific story. Amazing comic. Go check it out. It's like 20 volumes. Not bad. And hey, it's done. Can't say that about many runs of non-Marvel or DC Western comics. They go on forever or they go on permanent hiatuses. I'm looking at you, Injection. But overall, it's a great read. Highly recommended. I do have a lot of thoughts for this story that are spoiler filled. So if you haven't yet, please get out of here. Go give it a read. It's a comic. How long could it really take you? Like a day or two? Who knows? Go, maybe you read slower. Maybe it'll take a week and then you can come back. Maybe you should subscribe in the meantime to be able to get back here, to be able to see those spoiler thoughts, and then you will be able to move on to get to the spoilers. All right, it's spoiler time. Let's start with the big weakness I feel this story has, so I can move into just kind of gushing a bit about everything that I liked about it. The pacing dip that occurs near the middle of this story, when we start getting exposition from like H.G. Wells and Charlotte Bronte, and then even near the end when we get that exposition from the real creator of the world of Die, these all feel like the weakest points of the story. They are probably the most important points of the story, so I did like them and I found them interesting. interesting, but they felt like, oh no, we don't really have enough time for these characters to really find any other way to come to these conclusions, so we just gotta tell them in like big monologues. And that doesn't feel super great when you're reading it. But it does all feed into this super interesting, kind of complicated, so it's fair that it had to be told to us, bootstrap paradox, time travel-y spaghetti that I think was really well done in the way that it's crafted when you're looking back at it. It won't feel right when you're reading it, and that's a problem. And so I guess those moments really stick out as if these were written a bit better, if we got a more natural investigation and discovery of these ideas that are fueling this world, I think that would have been a lot better for the strength of this story. Perhaps if the story was a bit longer, Gillen would have felt less required to give us those dumps and could have better sprinkled it in through the story for the characters. It would have dodged out on this big word soup of information that we get all at once a couple of times, but honestly, it's not that bad. It is the most noticeable issue that I have with the story, though. And that's honestly it. That's probably the biggest gripe that I have, and that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen other people take issue with in the story is, man, these middle comics are kind of dragging a bit. I never felt like they dragged necessarily. I was eaten up that we saw famous literary people. I like books, so obviously that's gonna be cool. But I noticed it. I felt it a little bit. And now that we got that out of the way, let's gush. I loved Soul. I loved his character. I loved this bait and switch that happens where he seems like he's gonna be the big bad evil guy at the end of the book, but actually he gets taken out really early on, but then he doesn't totally get taken out. He's actually going to become a character. So he moves from like big end of the rainbow MacGuffin to easy cheesy solution in the middle to a character who has depth, to who we get to explore his perspective of being stuck here for the last 27 years. We get to empathize with, which is kind of difficult to do when a character dies. Yeah, we can maybe get flashbacks or we can get other scenes, but to have them talk about it, to have other characters interact with him and see the struggles and the pain that he's gone through, it brings him to another level. I wish we got a bit more screen time with him as my minor complaint about his character, but otherwise, I think every choice that was made with Soul was so strong and so interesting and rather unique for every time I had an expectation of, oh, okay, so he's dead. He's out of the story. We have a different issue. No, he's still here. He's just not an issue, or he's not the same kind of issue that we thought he was going to be. And okay, I gotta go back. I do have a minor, major, omega complaint, and it's we get a dog dies chapter in this book. It's not long, and the dog comes back. But Gillen even admits it in his small essay at the end of the book that he feels bad that he had to do this. He really had to make me feel feelings for that robot dog. You don't catch me crying over Goddard in Jimmy Neutron, and you know why? Because that dog doesn't die in that show. And for that, I hate you. Okay, back to good things. I really like the representation we see in this story. From Ash and their gender fluidity to their sister Angela being bi. I think that those are really core tenets to a tabletop RPG. I wish we didn't info dump a few pages near the end regarding what gender fluidity is. It felt a bit out of place, kind of like a after school PSA kind of thing, the way they were talking. It did kind of jar me out of the story and felt a little weird. But the overall story arc for Ash, glancing past that one moment, is so incredible. You get a lot of points in the story where you get a feeling for what's going on. You see it, you feel it, even the characters have kind of an idea, but we keep pushing it down. And that's a problem. And that ultimate point where they have to come to terms with their own personhood is all the more powerful because we keep dodging around this issue for 19 volumes. And time again, I see interviews where I see people talking about how TTRPGs were the first time they got to be gay, or how they got to play a character that was not the gender that they present as, and the ability for those game tables and those stories to be the safe place for that starting point of exploration of emotions and things so close to themselves is something I've always admired about D&D and other tabletop RPGs. Though, yes, I love numbers. Stick me in a 50 by 50 white void room and let me duke it out to do some crazy mechanical crunch damage. That's where my brain buzzes. But I cannot downplay how much freedom and safety and enjoyment there is at a table for people to tell stories, to explore those ideas. And I loved that this was such a core tenet of this comic, with that exploration of coming to terms of who you are through your character. There's also like a light tertiary theme of playing with, are these NPCs real people or are they not? Are they one-note flat characters that the DM just kind of throws out to fill the world, or are they deeper than that? And all those moments that make you question that deeper level to these characters is so well handled. At times, it was painful to read. It happens hardest with the dwarves that are following Chuck around. They're played off super early as a joke that they're just flat 1D characters. One can only be happy, one can only be dour. And that comes back later and it hits you in the heart so hard that I needed to take a break from reading for a little bit. It sucked to read those sad moments about two dwarf characters that are supposed to be his drinking buddies and big jokes. I love the Thaco cult. They show up in maybe 10 frames total, but Thaco, for those that don't know, is to hit AC 0. It's some awful eldritch horror mechanic that existed in early editions of D&D, and it's what armor class replaces. It's what AC is now taking the place of, thank God. And for this cult to be uttering those eldritch phrases as they sacrifice someone harkens back to the satanic panic of the early days in the 1980s of D&D, where D&D not only was inaccessible from being that thing that had all that fear from the general population behind it, but also it was so inaccessible to understand at a basic level. I swear, for experience calculation, you were having to do calculus, and I think for combat, you probably needed a math PhD at the table to do it successfully. But hey, look how far we've come from that. Now you can probably count on your fingers and get through a whole campaign. I want to shout out Gillen for hamstringing these characters every opportunity he got. I talked about ramifications earlier, but the narrative skill that Gillen showcases by creating such dire situations for characters that feel like hard decisions for them, where the decision from a very logical perspective is, do I want to do this thing that makes me feel good, or do I want to do this thing that is objectively the correct decision that will save the day? Those feel like hard decisions. Even when you're reading them, you know that this character is struggling, and oftentimes they choose the wrong decision. And all of those moments, because of how real they felt and how connected to the characters we are able to be at those moments, felt so good. From Ash's ever-present hamstringing mechanic of she can only have one person under her control at any given time, to Angela's need for gold and desire to keep the ones that she loves safe, like her dog, like her daughter. These decisions feel like real issues. Even if you know that you can bring the dog back, you know that it's hard for Angela to watch that dog die when dawn comes. These decisions were so powerful in building that tension that we understand at a character level. No matter how logical the better option is, it's still hard to make the right decision. This ended up being way longer than I thought it would be. I thought, oh, it'll be a comic. How much could I honestly have to say? It's only 20 volumes. But I did not expect this story to cut so deep to my core. Yeah, I played D&D, but the themes other than that this explores, and the character moments and the literary exploration throughout all of the pages of this comic were so close to my affinities. And I really appreciate just how much Gillen was able to do in only 20 volumes. A feat that some infinitely running manga or even Western comics could only dream of exploring. And for that, I have to say that I would have loved to pause in this world just as Ash did, but I need to appreciate that this story, like so many campaigns, must come to an end for the better. Have you played TTRPGs? What was your favorite moment in a campaign that you played with friends or random people? TTRPGs always have that really cool aspect that you just need to get a couple of people at the table. Maybe you don't even know each other. Maybe you're at a comic shop. Tell me your favorite moment or your favorite character that you've played throughout your history with those tabletop games. Let me know down in those comments. And while you're down there, why don't you hit that like button if you thought anything I had to say in this was cool? And if you haven't yet, why don't you hit that subscribe button? I'm posting weekly content coming out on Sundays, talking about books, talking about comics, talking about narrative craft as a whole. I want to get people hyped for as many different stories as I can. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I'll catch you in the next one. And until then, stay lit.